Hey, everybody, and welcome to our deep dive today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
We're going to be tackling a subject that's,
A big one.
it really is close to my heart, and I think close to a lot of our listeners too. Building a marriage that truly stands the test of time,
That's it.
the kind that's rooted in faith. And thankfully, we've
Yeah.
got a fantastic resource to guide us this podcast script called Seven Powerful Principles for a Godly Marriage. What I love about it is that it doesn't just stay theoretical.
Right.
It tries to give us actionable steps.
Yeah. And what's really striking to me is how much it resonates with what Scripture's been saying for centuries.
For a long time.
You know?
It's not a new idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive in.
Let's do it.
Principle number one is all about putting Yahweh at the center of your marriage.
Okay.
Now, I know that can sound a bit abstract, so what does that actually look like day to day?
You know, it's interesting you see these power couples in the news, like celebrities and politicians.
Yeah.
And they're constantly talking about their shared values, right?
Right, and they build whole brands around that idea.
They do. And in a faith-based marriage, that shared value is Yahweh. It's less about rules and more about having that same North Star
Yeah,
guiding your individual lives and your life together.
yeah. But we're human. We mess up.
Yeah.
So how can we even be sure that we're understanding God's will for our relationship, let alone following it perfectly?
You're right. There's no magic formula.
Yeah.
But the source reminds us of that verse in Matthew 6:33. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you.
Right.
It's about aligning our priorities.
Yeah, that's so true. It's like when you try to juggle too many things at once, something's got to give.
Exactly. And when we put God first, it impacts how we make decisions as a couple, how we resolve conflict,
Yeah.
even just the overall vibe of our relationship.
The energy.
Yeah.
The source doesn't just stop at seeking God, though. They also talk about communication, but they call it kingdom-focused communication. It sounds a little jargony to me.
I get that, but bear with me.
Okay.
It's basically saying, imagine if every conversation you had with your spouse was filtered through your faith.
Oh, so instead of just reacting in the heat of the moment,
Exactly.
you take a beat.
You pause and you think, okay, what would love look like here? What would patience sound like?
It reminds me of Proverbs 15.1. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. But honestly, with all this social media drama and instant reactions these days, that feels harder than ever.
Oh, absolutely. It's a real challenge. That's where being intentional comes in, like choosing to really listen to understand,
Yeah.
not just to respond.
The source also has a great tip about using I statements instead of blaming your partner.
Oh, that's a good one.
So that way you're owning your feelings without making it an attack.
Takes practice, but it can really change the dynamic.
Yeah.
Because you're not trying to win an argument. You're trying to understand each other.
Right, okay. Principle number 3 is one that always gets me: serving each other the way Yahweh serves us. Beautiful concept. But how do we actually live that out?
Think of it like this. You know how there are always trends on social media about self-care, putting yourself first?
Oh, yeah?
This flips the script. It's about saying, how can I put my partner's needs before my own?
Like those viral videos where someone does something incredibly thoughtful for their spouse
Yes.
and everyone melts.
But it doesn't have to be grand gestures. It's the everyday stuff.
Yeah.
Making coffee, doing a chore. They hate being that listening ear when they've had a tough day.
Yeah, the source brings up Ephesians 5.25, which talks about husbands loving their wives, like Christ loved the church. That's a high bar.
It is, but there's also Titus 2.4, which talks about wives loving their husbands in a way that honors God.
Right.
It's not one-sided. It's about mutual service rooted in love.
And I think it's important to say service doesn't mean becoming a doormat.
Of course not.
It's about choosing to love actively.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing your partner's value and wanting to support them in a way that strengthens you both.
Okay, now for principle number 4, and I'll be honest, this one's a tough one for me: daily forgiveness. Why is it so essential and why is it so hard?
You hit the nail on the head. It's both those things.
Yeah.
Think of it like this: holding on to anger and resentment is like carrying a heavy weight around. It impacts everything.
Yeah, and we've all got those moments where we'd rather cling to being right
We do.
than let go.
Totally. But the source reminds us of Colossians 3:13. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you.
It's that "as the Lord forgave you" part that always gets me. Talk about a high standard.
Right. But it also highlights the power of that forgiveness.
Yeah.
Think about how freeing it feels when you truly let go of something that's been eating at you.
Oh, yeah.
Now imagine bringing that into your marriage.
But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or pretending things didn't happen, right?
No, it's about releasing the negative hold those hurts have over you. It's choosing to move forward in healing both for yourself and the relationship.
So, practically speaking, how do we even begin to forgive when it feels impossible?
First, be honest about the hurt. Don't try to sweep it under the rug. Then make a conscious choice to let go. It's not about your feelings magically disappearing, it's a decision.
Right.
The source also talks about praying for your spouse, asking God to help you see them the way he does.
That's a good one.
That's powerful because sometimes we need that shift in perspective to soften our hearts. And remember, forgiveness is a process, not a switch you flip.
It's a journey, and sometimes it might even require seeking professional help.
Absolutely.
But it's worth it for the freedom and peace it brings.
Yeah.
Okay, ready for principle number 5?
Hit me.
This one's all about being intentional about togetherness. Oh, man, in today's world, that's tough. We're all so busy.
So busy.
Overscheduled, glued to our phones.
It's true. I saw this meme the other day that said, date night now is just sitting on the couch, both staring at our phones, but at least we're in the same room.
Oh, my gosh. So relatable, but so sad.
I know.
The source connects us back to Genesis 2.24. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh.
Right.
You can't be one flesh if you're living separate lives, even when you're under the same roof.
You can't.
So how do we break out of that?
Well, date nights are great,
Right.
but honestly, it's more about those small, consistent moments.
Yeah.
Sharing coffee in the morning, going for a walk after dinner, tech-free time before bed.
Being present.
Yes.
Not just physically in the same space.
And it's about finding those shared joys.
Yeah.
Those things that bring you together, whether it's a hobby, a TV show, or just laughing at silly inside jokes.
Speaking of things that bring you together,
Okay.
principle number 6 is all about praying together.
Okay.
I've always heard that say the couple that prays together stays together. Is there really something to that?
You know, it's more than just a catchy phrase. When you pray together, you're inviting God into the center of your relationship.
It's like Matthew 18.20 says, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I with them."
That's powerful.
That's a powerful image.
And prayer isn't just about asking for things.
Right.
It's about expressing gratitude, talking to God about your hopes and fears, interceding for each other.
I've also found that praying together can be really helpful during conflict. It forces you to approach the situation with humility.
That's a great point because you're both acknowledging your need for God's guidance.
Yeah.
You're on the same team facing the challenge together.
Okay, before we move on to part 2 of this deep dive,
Okay.
let's touch on principle number 7, trusting God's timing.
Okay.
In a world obsessed with instant gratification, this one's a real doozy.
Oh, it is. We're bombarded with messages telling us to hustle, achieve, get everything we want now.
Yeah.
But that mentality can wreak havoc on relationships.
The source brings up Jeremiah 29.11. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope."
That's a verse that's got me through some tough times.
That too.
It's a reminder that God's plan is bigger than our own timelines and expectations.
So when it comes to relationships, it means
Trusting that God knows when the right time is for things to happen. Whether it's meeting the right person, working through a challenge in your marriage, or even waiting for that dream you both share to come true.
it's about surrendering our need to control and saying, "Okay, God, I trust your plan."
Which, let's be honest, is way easier said than done.
Way easier.
But the peace that comes from that surrender is worth it.
So we've covered a lot of ground here in part 1. We talked about putting God first, communicating with intention, serving each other, practicing forgiveness, being present, praying together, and trusting God's timing.
It's amazing how much wisdom is packed into just these 7 principles, and we've only just scratched the surface.
We'll be back soon with part 2, where we'll dive even deeper into these principles and explore how you can apply them in your own life, whether you're married, single, or somewhere in between.
Welcome back to our deep dive, everybody.
Oh, it's good to be back.
We're diving into these powerful principles for building a marriage centered on faith.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but even just revisiting these principles has me thinking about my own relationships in a new light. It's easy to let these things slide in the day-to-day,
Absolutely. It's like Anything worthwhile, it takes effort.
Yeah.
And intentionality, we were just talking about trusting God's timing, and I think that's especially relevant in today's world.
So relevant. It's so easy to get caught up in comparing ourselves to other couples,
Oh, yeah.
especially with social media constantly showcasing everyone's perfect lives.
Ugh, I feel like that saying comparison is the thief of joy.
Yes.
And it can really steal the joy from our relationships if we're not careful.
The source makes this point about how our culture is obsessed with instant gratification. We want everything now, and that can create so much anxiety when things don't go according to our plan.
It's like we forget that God's ways are higher than our ways.
Right.
His timing might not always match up with our own, but that doesn't mean he's not working behind the scenes.
The reference Jeremiah 29:11 again, where God says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope."
Such a good one.
It's such a reassuring reminder.
It is. It's about surrendering our need to control and saying, okay, God, I trust your plan, even if it looks different from what I had in mind.
Yeah, and that applies to all areas of relationships, right? From finding the right person to navigating challenges within a marriage.
Absolutely. Think of it like this. You're in a car and God's the one with the map.
Okay.
You might have an idea of where you want to go, but he knows the best route, even if it involves some detours.
Right, or unexpected turns.
Exactly.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how these principles play out in specific situations. For example, communication. It's always a hot topic.
Always.
How can couples apply that kingdom-focused communication when things get heated?
Well, first off, it's important to remember that conflict is normal.
Yeah.
In any relationship, it's not about never disagreeing. It's about how you disagree.
So instead of it being a battle to be won,
Right.
it's more like a puzzle you're trying to solve together.
Yes. And the source emphasizes putting your relationship with God and each other above the need to be right.
Oh, that's so challenging, though, especially in the heat of the moment.
It is.
It's like our instinct is to defend ourselves, even if we know we might be wrong.
It is. That's where the kingdom focus comes in. Taking that pause, remembering your shared values, and choosing words that build up rather than tear down.
Yeah, I know for me, sometimes I need to physically step away for a few minutes to calm down before I can have a productive conversation.
That's great self-awareness, and the source actually recommends that giving yourself space to process can be so helpful because it's not about suppressing your feelings.
Right.
It's about channeling them in a healthy way.
They also talk about active listening, really trying to understand where your partner is coming from.
And not just waiting for your turn to speak. It's about being fully present in the conversation.
Yeah.
Asking clarifying questions, even reflecting back what you've heard to make sure you're on the same page.
It's so easy to get caught up in our own heads.
It is.
Especially when we're feeling hurt or defensive. But taking the time to truly listen can make a world of difference.
It does. Now let's talk about serving each other like Yahweh serves us.
Okay.
We touched on this earlier, but how can couples practically incorporate this into their busy lives, especially when both partners are stressed and overwhelmed?
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to a friend the other day, and she was saying how her love language is acts of service. So for her, feeling loved means coming home to a clean kitchen or having her husband take care of a chore she hates.
That's a great example. It highlights how important it is to know your partner's love language.
Yeah.
What makes them feel truly seen and appreciated.
Because what feels like an act of service to one person might not mean as much to someone else.
Exactly. It's about speaking their language.
Yeah.
Whether it's words of affirmation, quality time gifts, physical touch, or acts of service.
The source makes a point that's really resonated with me. It's not about keeping score or expecting something in return.
Right.
It's about serving out of love, wanting to make your partner's life a little bit easier and brighter.
It's like that verse in Colossians 3:23. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters.
Right?
It's about shifting our perspective.
Instead of seeing it as a chore or an obligation.
It becomes an act of love, a way to honor God through serving your spouse.
Okay, let's dive into the deep end with this next one.
Okay.
Daily forgiveness. We talked about how important it is, but how do we actually do it, especially when the hurt feels really deep?
It's tough. There's no sugarcoating it. It starts with being honest with yourself about the pain you're feeling. Don't try to brush it off or pretend it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think we're often afraid to acknowledge the depth of our hurt. Because it feels like it makes us weak or vulnerable.
But the source actually encourages that vulnerability. It's about creating a safe space where you can be honest with each other without judgment.
And then comes the hard part, actually choosing to forgive.
And it's important to clarify, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or condoning the behavior.
Right.
It's about releasing the resentment, that bitterness that can poison a relationship.
The source reminds us of Colossians 3:13 again, where it
Yeah.
says, forgive as the Lord forgave you. That's a tall order.
It is, but it also reminds us that we've all been forgiven of so much.
Yeah.
It's about extending that same grace to our spouse, even when it's hard.
And sometimes that forgiveness might involve setting boundaries or seeking professional help
Yeah.
if there's a pattern of hurt or abuse.
Absolutely. Protecting yourself is important. But even in those situations, forgiveness is still possible. It might be a long process, but it's ultimately about freeing yourself from that pain.
It's like choosing to heal, both for yourself and for the relationship.
Okay, let's shift gears to a topic that's probably on everyone's mind these days, intentional togetherness.
Yeah.
How do we make time for each other when life feels like a constant whirlwind?
I feel like we're constantly bombarded with messages about productivity,
Yes.
side hustles, achieving more, and it's easy to let our relationships fall by the wayside.
It's true we live in a culture of busyness,
Yeah.
but we have to remember that our relationships are the foundation of everything else.
The source goes back to that verse in Genesis, the one about becoming one flesh.
Uh-huh.
And it makes me think, how can you be one flesh if you're constantly running in opposite directions?
You can't, it takes effort to cultivate the togetherness. Date nights are great, but honestly, it's more about those everyday moments.
Yeah.
Sharing a meal, going for a walk, putting away your phones, and actually talking to each other.
It's like those small, consistent deposits into the relationship bank account, right?
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It's about being present, listening, sharing laughter, creating those memories that weave your lives together.
You know, I think technology can be both a blessing and a curse when it comes to relationships. It allows us to stay connected, but it can also be a major distraction.
It's all about finding that balance, like setting aside tech-free time each day, whether it's during dinner or before bed.
Yeah.
Those uninterrupted moments can be so valuable.
Speaking of things that connect us, let's talk about praying together.
Okay.
We touched on this briefly earlier, but I'd love to dive a bit deeper.
I love that the source highlights the power of shared prayer.
Yeah.
It's more than just saying words. It's about inviting God into the center of your relationship.
Like that verse in Matthew where it says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I with them. It's like creating this sacred space where you're connecting with God and with each other.
And it doesn't have to be formal or fancy. It could be as simple as holding hands and saying a quick prayer before meals, thanking God for your blessings and asking for his guidance.
I've found that even just taking a few minutes to pray together before bed can make a huge difference.
Oh, yeah.
It's like ending the day on a note of unity and gratitude.
Absolutely. And it doesn't always have to be about asking for things. It could be reading a passage of scripture together and
Yeah.
discussing how it speaks to your lives, or simply sitting in silence, allowing God's presence to fill the space between you.
It's about creating that spiritual connection, that shared sense of faith that can carry you through life's storms.
Now let's talk about that last principle again, trusting God's timing.
Okay.
This can be a tough one to grasp, especially when we're facing challenges or longing for something we desperately desire.
It's easy to get discouraged when things don't happen according to our timeline, isn't it?
It is.
Especially when we see others seemingly getting what they want, whether it's a relationship, a career change, or that dream vacation.
It's so true. But the source reminds us that comparison is a trap. God's plan for us is unique, and it unfolds in his perfect timing, not ours.
It can be hard to surrender our expectations and anxieties to God, especially when it feels like he's taking his sweet time.
It is, but the source encourages us to look back and remember all the ways God has been faithful in the past. How he's provided for us, guided us, protected us.
It's about remembering that he's always been there, and he's not going to abandon us now.
And it's about focusing on his promises. His word is full of reassurances that we can cling to even when our circumstances feel shaky.
Promises of his love, his presence, his provision, his perfect plan for our lives.
Trusting God's timing is ultimately about surrendering our will to his, knowing that he has our best interests at heart, even when we can't see the bigger picture.
And that takes faith, doesn't it?
It does.
It's about choosing to believe even when it's hard.
Absolutely. It's a journey, and it's not always easy, but the peace that comes from that surrender is worth it.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here in part 2 of our deep dives. We've talked about the challenges of trusting God's timing, the importance of communication, how to serve each other, the power of forgiveness, and the need for intentional togetherness.
And we've seen how these principles can be applied in real-life situations, even when things get messy or complicated.
We'll be back soon with part 3, where we'll explore even more practical tips and strategies for implementing these principles in your own relationship. Welcome back to the deep dive.
It's the final part
It is the final part
of our exploration.
of building a God-centered marriage.
We've covered so much ground already.
I know, right?
But the real magic happens when we take these principles and actually apply them.
Yes, because it's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to live it.
To live it out.
So let's dive into some practical tips and strategies.
Okay.
We started this whole discussion with putting Yahweh at the center of your marriage.
Hmm.
Where do we even begin with that?
Well, the source keeps coming back to prayer, both individually and as a couple.
It sounds simple.
It does.
I think it's easy to let that slide when life gets busy.
Oh, it is. But think of it like this. If you want to build a strong house, you need a solid foundation.
Okay.
Prayer is that foundation for a faith-based marriage.
So it's not just about saying a quick prayer before meals.
No, it's about making time for those deeper conversations with God.
Yeah.
Reading scripture together, maybe even finding a devotional you both connect with.
Really making it part of your lives
And aligning your individual spiritual lives with your life as a couple.
because you're building something together.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk communication.
Okay.
We've discussed kingdom-focused communication, but honestly, sometimes I just need practical tips.
Yeah.
What can couples do to improve their communication, especially when it feels like they're speaking different languages?
Well, one thing the source suggests is scheduling regular check-in times.
Okay.
It sounds kind of formal,
Yeah.
but it's basically creating that space for intentional communication.
Oh, so instead of letting things build up until you explode.
You have that designated time to talk about whatever's on your mind.
I like that.
It could be a weekly date night, a morning coffee routine, even just 15 minutes before bed where you put away your phones and really connect.
The key is that it's consistent
That's it.
and that it feels safe for both partners
Right.
to share openly.
Another tip that's so simple but so powerful is active listening.
Oh, man. That's a tough one for me. I'm such an interrupter.
We all have our challenges, but active listening is about more than just hearing the words.
Okay.
It's about being fully present in the conversation, putting aside your own thoughts and judgments, and truly trying to understand your partner's perspective.
So putting down your phone, making eye contact, asking clarifying questions.
Exactly. And sometimes it's about just being quiet and letting your partner share their heart without feeling like they need to defend themselves.
Now let's talk about serving each other like Yahweh serves us. I know we touched on this, but I'd love to get even more practical.
Okay, well, think back to our conversation about love languages.
Yes?
The source emphasizes how important it is to know your partner's love language and to speak it intentionally.
Because what feels like an act of service to one person might not mean as much to someone else.
It's true, like if your partner's love language is words of affirmation, doing the dishes might not mean as much as leaving them a sweet note or telling them how much you appreciate them.
It's about understanding what makes them feel loved and valued,
Yeah.
and then putting that into action.
And remember, it's not about keeping score or expecting something in return.
Right.
It's about serving out of love, wanting to bless your partner and make their life a little brighter.
Okay, the big one, forgiveness.
Ooh.
We all know it's essential, but it can feel impossible when the hurt is deep.
It's true, but the source reminds us that forgiveness is a process, and it often starts with creating that safe space for vulnerability.
Being able to share your hurt with your partner without fear of judgment or rejection.
And it's about remembering that we're all human. We all make mistakes, and we all need grace.
The source also talks about the importance of empathy,
Right.
trying to see things from your partner's perspective, even if you don't agree with them.
That's huge because sometimes understanding where they're coming from can make it easier to let go of the anger or resentment.
And remember, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or condoning the behavior.
That's right.
It's about releasing that hurt so it doesn't have power over you anymore.
Now let's tackle the busyness epidemic and talk about intentional togetherness. How do we make time for each other when it feels like there are never enough hours in the day?
It's a constant battle, right, between work, kids, social obligations, and just trying to keep up with everything. It's easy to let quality time with your spouse slip through the cracks.
The source emphasizes the importance of being proactive.
Okay.
It's about scheduling that time for each other, just like you would any other important appointment.
So putting date nights on the calendar, blocking out time for that weekend getaway.
Exactly, and it's about protecting that time fiercely. Turning off your phones, saying no to other commitments, and really giving each other your undivided attention.
It's about creating those shared experiences,
Yeah.
whether it's trying a new restaurant, going for a hike, or just cuddling up on the couch to watch a movie.
The point is to be fully present with each other, to
Yeah.
reconnect and recharge as a couple.
Okay, lastly, let's revisit trusting God's timing.
Okay.
This one can be so challenging, especially in a world that's constantly telling us to hustle and strive for more.
It's about remembering that God's plan for us is perfect even when we don't understand it.
Yeah, it's about surrendering our anxieties and fears to Him, knowing that He's got us covered.
The source encourages us to focus on his promises, to remind ourselves of his faithfulness in the past, and to trust that he's working all things together for our good, even when we can't see the bigger picture.
It's about choosing faith over fear, hope over despair, and trusting that His timing is perfect, even if it doesn't align with our own.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into these 7 powerful principles for a godly marriage, let's remember that this is a journey, not a destination.
A process.
It's about continually learning, growing, and seeking God's guidance in our relationships.
It's about remembering that we're not perfect, but with God's grace and the support of each other, we can build marriages that reflect His love and stand the test of time. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. I hope you've gained some valuable insights and feel equipped to start applying these principles in your own life.
Remember, building a strong marriage is a lifelong adventure.
It is.
And it's a journey worth taking. Until next time, keep diving deep.